and Nelson on October 8th, 1986. Ralph, could you please give me some of your vital statistics?
Well, I was born and raised in Kaslo, spent all my childhood there, attended school, and my father was in business there, having come into the Kootenays in 1890. He was only 20 when he arrived in the Nelson area. He'd come down the Columbia River from Revelstoke in the steamer Lytton, and on into Nelson. He was looking around for an outlet for some merchandising on behalf of his father and an uncle, Nicholas Garland. Now, getting back to myself, I spent my school days in Kaslo.
When were you born?
Oh, pardon me. June the 18th, 1902. That puts me well up in the 80s. Okay, I saw the good days in Kaslo when, as a young boy, the big sawmill operating there, and the bay in Kaslo full of logs, 2 steam companies, steamboats running into Kaslo, the Great Northern, with the famous steamer Kaslo, and the International, and of course the CPR ran in there with a number of boats headed by the Kokanee, the steamer Moyer, and Kuskanook, along with a whole flotilla of tugboats. In the headquarters in Kaslo, Angus Campbell had a towing outfit there with a tug Hercules, hauling lime rock at the time. As a youngster, he was hauling lime rock to the Hall Mines Smelter down here in Nelson.
Where did they get the lime rock?
From a deposit about 10 miles north of Kaslo, what you'd call Shoulder Creek. It was an open pit, and they had Chinese trundling the broken limestone onto the small barges that they hauled down the lake and on into Nelson, where it was mostly all hand labor at that time. This sawmill was operated by Cook Brothers, Minneapolis. Good big sawmill for a sawmill of those days. And the lumber was stacked for drying. There was no such thing as dryers in those days. And the town had a whole colony of Hindus, giant men there, who did all the trundling and wheeling of the lumber out to the stacking area where it was stacked for drying. And then in later years, there was a planer put in there to put out the finished product. Now, I remember the days of the steamers, of course, in particular, with the Great Northern boats running into the bay section of Kaslo, and the CPR wharf in those days was the bottom end of what is now Front Street, not too far from where the Moyer is in dry dock today. It was a floating wharf, and of course got an awful beating from the winds from the north, and adjacent to it was the Lindsay Boat Works. Lindsay had come in the country from Ontario and had set up a boat building layout there, and it just seemed that the town was full of canoes and rowboats of all sizes and shapes, and with no motorboats around at that time. my father, of course, was keenly interested in getting a boat, and Mr. Wheeler of Ainsworth brought a carload of boats in from Detroit, 18 to 20-foot steel-hulled, Michigan steel-hulled boats with a Detroit engine, and the horsepower would be between 3 and 5 horsepower, and these chugged along with it at anywhere from 6 to 7 miles an hour. Beautiful boats for fishing, and the town, of course, was full of ardent fishermen who just simply rowed a boat. And I point out in those days that the season for fishing opened on the 1st of May and closed on the 31st of October. The lake was simply teeming with fish. So I had my fair share of the tremendous fishing. My father, having a boat, was very popular. He had all sorts of people wanting to fish with him every Sunday in particular, so I was sort of born and raised with a fishing rod in my hand. Now, getting around to my school days, I recall some of the teachers, Miss English, Miss Thompson, and Elizabeth Gigrich, among others, and an assortment of principals in the four-room school, which I would say would be the third school in Kaslo. My mother had attended 2 schools back in the 90s. I might point out, to start with, that my mother was born in Ontario, and the family migrated out. Her maiden name was Harris, and they migrated out to the Idaho country, and she arrived in Kaslo as a youngster of 07 or 8 in 1893. My father had located in Nelson just for the 1 year at the menswear store in the street that the Hume Hotel is presently on.
Vernon Street.
What's that?
Vernon
Street. He had a menswear store there, supplying, and the Hall Mines Smelter, of course, was big business then, and the stock, of course, was brought in. Most of it was brought in to Bonner's Ferry and Bond, and brought down into Nelson with the paddle wheelers, which were, of course, all over the place there. The Great Northern operated 3 or 4 small ones on Kootenai Lake, in addition to the 2 great big ones they had there, the Kaslo and the International. Now those boats were built and put together at Mirror Lake. The shipyards for the Great Northern were at Mirror Lake, and the Nelson boats were built down here in the old shipyards, which would be down around where the present bridge is.
The RCMP building.
I remember the man. Mr. Curran was the shipyard general foreman there, the father of Bill Curran, who came along later. Now, in those days, Kaslo was considered a great northern town, and Nelson, of course, blossomed out as a shipyard town because it was hooked up to the railroad, which came up from East Robson into Nelson. He only stayed the 1 year in Nelson, and then the big strike was made up in the Slocan and the Payne Mountain, and he moved everything lock, stock, and barrel into Kaslo and spent the rest of his life there, dying, and he died in 1939. So My mother lived on a few years after that, and they were both more or less raised in Kaslo.
He ran a dry goods store, didn't he?
He had a dry goods store and later blossomed into ladies' wear along with the menswear store. He had rented premises to start with in what later was the Maze Hotel. And I will recall in later years seeing in the drawer of his desk at the store this pistol, and he said, "Oh yes, in those days they always kept a pistol around, an old clunker of a revolver, I can tell you." The big fire, the flood and the fire hit Kaslo in the year 1894. 1894, of course, is the highest recorded water that was ever recorded through Kootenai Lake and records down in the lower Columbia by the House of Astor backed up the statement that 1894 was the highest water recorded in the mouth of Columbia. It's up to 1805 or 1806 when they were at Fort Astoria. That 1894 high water mark in Kaslo would reach. The steamer landed at approximately where the brick building is located today, the R&K block, across the street from the present location of the Moyer. That boat landed right at that building, and the high water mark was registered at 31 feet 6 or 7 inches. There are marks on Kootenai Lake that you can locate where the 1894 mark reached, and today, of course, the high water is all behind us, although 10 feet today under the controlled dams that are on the Kootenai Lake watershed today, they have it set at around about 10 feet as the highest level that you'll record through Kaslo or Nelson. Incidentally, this past summer it did get up to 10'3" in the area where I was located in Garland Bay. Now, as a youth, I remember the narrow gauge railroad running into Kaslo almost on a daily schedule. It was a narrow gauge with the smokestacks that caught the cinders, and in latter years they brought in a big standard gauge locomotive and mounted on the narrow gauge wheels.
Was this on the Kaslo Slocan Railway?
And that ran on the K&S, yes. It ran up to Bear Lake and Fish Lake, and went in on a level grade right into Sandon, going around Payne Bluff and into Sandon. The cinder catch type locomotives were of course small compared with this big loki that they brought in there. And our neighbors next door in the family home, was Pat Walsh was the superintendent. And of course this locomotive had a rotary plow for winter operation, one of the few and only ones that I've ever seen in the country. It whirled in and out of Kaslo and on from Bear Lake, Fish Lake, through the Lucky Jim and the upper operations of the Rambler Caribou Mine, rounded Payne Bluff way high up, and on into Sandon on a level grade.
Did it climb sort of from
It
the
climbed
lakes?
from Kaslo up.
Okay.
That was pretty stiff grade, out of town. It switched back from the Great Northern Station in Kaslo was right where the remnants of the present day CPR station is down in the bay. They did not have a slipway. Everything was just morphed into a rough wharf that the Great Northern had, and the boats at nighttime docked across the lake, across the bay, about where Jones Boys Marina is today. The sampler was located there, where all the ore was from the Slocan country was put through there, a crushing plant, and sampled and hauled south for treatment, down mostly to a lot of it to, I would say into, the Pilot Bay Smelter was operating on ore from the Bluebell, but being strictly a furnace type operation, that it just melted the zinc and lead together, and the sulfide ores, why they couldn't separate them. That's fizzled out in a hurry. But I recall at Pilot Bay, the beehive ovens were there where they made the charcoal, which was the operating fuel for the smelter at Pilot Bay. And then, of course, with the completion of the Crow's Nest Railroad in 1897, my coke was available, of course, from Michelle. But
that Pilot Bay Smelter was closed by Samuel Stewart Fowler, wasn't it?
Pardon?
Fowler. Samuel Stewart Fowler. Didn't he close that smelter? Pilot Bay?
Hendricks owned it and built it, you see.
Right.
Dr. Hendricks. But it was run essentially on non-concentrate ore. It weren't even put through jig mills. It was a straight blast furnace. They, of course, had lots of lime rock available here and there along the lake, and that was the operation of the lime rock kiln north of Kaslo. Not only was opened up then, it also operated when the Hall Mines Smelter was in operation here in Nelson. The railroad that came into Nelson would be the Columbia and Western, I think, and it was later bought out by the CPR. But in the first place, I would say it was operated under the wing of possibly Jim Hill and the Great Northern. There were all sorts of small boats on the lake. We have some in my father's collection of pictures with us. We've got a few real ancient ones. The Lardeau country was unheard of up until really it opened up when the CPR started the construction of the railroad from Lardeau, and the Great Northern were building from Argenta.
Was that the A&K?
Pardon?
Was that the Arrowhead Kootenai?
Well, that was strictly a Great Northern operation, and Pat Burns had brought cattle in through what later became Earl Gray's Pass, and he had a big slaughterhouse at Argenta, and he supplied these Pat Burns stores, meat stores in Kaslo, Sandon, Ainsworth, and Nelson.
Okay.
They later, of course, in Trail and Rossland, Pat Burns had a tight rein on the meat imported into the Kootenays. Now, the Great Fire of 1910, which started at around Three Forks and burned straight towards Kaslo. It burned for some 16 miles. And as an 8-year-old boy at the time of that fire, I recall the survivors from the various towns and mining operations, the Rambler Caribou, the Lucky Jim, and the great operation, the Whitewater, which of course was the biggest operation in the Kootenays at that time. It was high-grade silver, and they brought all the people into Kaslo on the flat deck, narrow gauge, which ran into Kaslo, and most of those people just settled in Kaslo and later became well-known citizens there. That was the death knell of the Whitewater. All the bridges burned out between the Lucky Jim mine. All the bridges burned out into Sandon, and several in and around Whitewater. And for a year or two afterwards, the Great Northern did run a kind of a little one-horse operation up to 15-mile, as we called it, Sproul Junction, which was around Spring Creek comes in there. It would be around the present Bear Creek, which would be 15, 16 miles out of Kaslo. And then it was in later years, of course, they badgered the government. And Kaslo, of course, had a lot of well-known politicians, and they had lots of pull in Victoria, and they got the grant finally to rebuild the Great Northern had surrendered their franchise and all the land that went with it. The CPR picked it up, of course, and they started converting it from a narrow gauge operation out of Kaslo, put a standard gauge up. Took a couple of years to reconstruct it to standard gauge, and at Bear Lake, it went down the Seaman Creek to Three Forks, and of course everything else was abandoned on the narrow gauge. The old twisted rails laid up there in Payne Bluff for decades afterwards. As a matter of fact, I think you could still find some stringers up there.
If you know where to look.
Yes, if you know where to look. McGuigan was quite a spot on from the Lucky Jim operation. That's where the Rambler Caribou town site was. Incidentally, in that great fire that swept up there, it took about, I would say, a day and a half to 2 days, and torrential downpour of rain snuffed out the fire, and that was it. But it burned right to the skyline, burned everything out. There was a lot of small operating mines there, and to the best of my knowledge, there were 3 or 4 people suffocated to death in the Lucky Jim mine, which had a ventilation raised to the surface, and that just became a smoke. The smoke got in there and went up there right as a chimney. At the Rambler Caribou, where everybody from McGuigan got in the tunnels there, while they even had all their horses and teams of horses and everything in the tunnels, and they had wet blankets hanging over them, and there was not a fatality in and around the big operation of Rambler Caribou, which was one of the big mines in that valley.
Whereabouts was it located?
It would be about 3 to 4 miles down from Bear Lake and Fish Lake on what you'd call Seaman Creek.
Okay, towards Kaslo.
Towards Three Forks.
Three Forks. Okay.
It'd be about 3 to 4 miles down. The Rambler Caribou mine was a high-grade mine, and all those mines in that area, their headquarters and head offices were in Kaslo. Rambler Caribou, Lucky Jim, the Whitewater, all their head offices were in Kaslo, and resident superintendents lived in the Kaslo area. Mr. Zwicky and John Elder Tallick.
Well, Whitewater became Retallick afterwards?
Yes, Retallick, named after John L. Retallick, who was the resident superintendent or general manager for the English company that owned the mine. That was an English outfit, and they mined. It was a jig mill operation. They mined and milled in that jig mill some 200,000 ton of ore, just extracting the nuggets of lead.
What do you mean by jig mill?
Well, it riffles. They crush it down into nodular size, perhaps 1 to 2 inches, and then they riffle it it was a strict gravity deal. The ganche material, even taking the zinc, went out as tailings, and all it went, the zinc was strictly the lead nuggets, and that was all the whole Slocan country was operated on that basis. All those mills in and around Sandon to start were jig mills, and they just produced the lead nuggets and the ganche material containing zinc, which was lighter, was float. It just was riffled off, and the nuggets went down the side, the small nuggets, and of course there being argentiferous clina were almost pure lead, while 80 to 90% would be a good jig mill lead product, 80 to 90%. But the silver values, of course, what carried the Slocan country, and of course, when the price of silver crashed and the Pittman Act came in, why silver dropped down to 35, 40, 50 cents an ounce.
What was it prior to that? Do you remember?
$1, $1 to $1.10, and there was a zinc penalty. Of course, Trail Smelter had a zinc penalty for any zinc that did go with the lead, and that was a sore point for many years. Because I presume in Trail they gradually stored a lot of the material which was put through as refined zinc many years later. Now I spent all my youth in Kaslo. Most of the old hotels were still standing. The famous Slocan Hotel, the largest building in Kaslo, other than the famous Kamik, they were all standing as a 8 or 10-year-old boy. I remember the one after another them being pulled down and the lumber used. They had the square head nails. The Kamik building was quite something. It was built apparently in 1891 or 1892. It was one of the largest edifices in the Slocan country. Presbyterian Church still is a landmark. Of course, it was there at the time of the flood even. It was built apparently in 93 or 94. And but my father was a shutterbug, and he used to, they said that, they tell a story that he gingerly knocked on the door of this Kamik building, and the good lady that ran the operation there would let him go upstairs and on the roof, and there he got some famous pictures of the flood, which swept not too far away, within a couple 100 feet of the building. The building would be at the bottom end of A Avenue. And that's the one at the present hill that leads up to the upper part of town. That's the A Avenue. B Avenue was where my father's family residence. The house was built in 1901.
Was this the Kamik Theatre, which is...
Pardon?
Kamik Theatre, isn't that it?
Yes, it was
a lot of ladies.
All ladies and gambling, and the remnants of as they knocked it down, it took F.E. Archer, who later was in the harbor business in Kaslo and was the mayor of Kaslo for many years. He bought it, and his old father, who was in 1910, started to to raise it and knock it down. He started on the roof and worked two years taking it down piece by piece and throwing it down the ground and salvaging these square-headed nails. And a lot of lumber went into salvage, and Archer built a number of homes around Kaslo with the salvage lumber from the old Kamik. Of course, the houses of ill fame were just down below there. But the town itself was a combination of American lumbermen. Hindus did all the work, and it operated until the First World War. It was still in operation in the start of the First World War, the sawmill in Kaslo. And it cut, I'd say, between 60 and 80,000 board feet on a running shift.
What was the name of the sawmill?
It was the Cook Brothers Sawmill. And they were a splinter group of the Great Northern headquarters in Minneapolis. They all tied in. And in later years, after the World War I, Howland and Maltz, another splinter group from the Great Northern, picked up some of the land grants, and they operated out of Kaslo, three or four camps out of Kaslo, cutting ties and poles and posts for shipment to the States. But they went into bankruptcy, and that was the end of the logging and timbering operation actually in Kaslo. There were a number of small operations there. English Brothers had a small operation out in the base of True Blue Mountain, which was the mountain that lays just south of the town site of Kaslo. They had a small sawmill out there, and I recall my father telling me that the birch wood was cut out at the English Brothers mill and decked there and hand planed, and the floor went down into the drill hall, the armoury in Kaslo, which was built at the time of the Boer War in 1901. The Rocky Mountain Rangers was a very active group. There was a big, well, I would say 50 to 60 men enrolled in the Rocky Mountain Rangers under Colonel Holmes and the Major Potters, and my father held a lieutenancy to start with, and eventually became a captain. Was at the end of the operation, he trained the cadet corps for a year or two along the way. But the drill hall today, which of course is the Legion headquarters in Kaslo, was directly the result of, and there was a drill hall in Nelson, there was a drill hall in Rossland, and there was another one in Fernie. They were all built at the time of the Boer War. And that birch floor was still, I don't know whether it's still there or been replanked yet, but that birch floor was still in use. Been down there 50, 60 years at the time I left Kaslo and headed for trail. Now, I finished my schooling in Kaslo, my senior matriculation, and I worked for Howland Walls for a year there, and then went to trail in 1922. Now, let's see, I recall some of the smaller boats that operated, tugboats and smaller boats, both by the CPR. Their headquarters, of course, was at the bottom end of Front Street. They had a floating wharf there, and the CPR telegraph office. The only outside communication until the BC telephone went in was by telegraph, and the line was strung right along the lake shore from Kaslo north to Lardeau and from Kaslo south, all strung along the lake right down to hook up for the operations in Nelson. But once the fire swept through there in 1910, that was the end of the Great Northern operation. The two boats were put into dry dock in the Mirror Lake area and dismantled, and that was the end of them there. And the Great Northern just pulled out and abandoned everything in the lake and they ended their operations. As far as I know, the International could have been taken down to the South Bay, Galena Bay at Riondale, and was beached there. Would be he was a barber in Nelson. He had it kind of as a summer home there, and then later fell to pieces there. But it was located about where the Cominco operations were in the South Bay at Galena Bay.
Well, there's remnants or the hull of an old boat, and I don't know what it's called, around Deanshaven. Is that the same?
That would be that would be one of the Great Northern boats. Now the tugboats, Angus Campbell owned the privately owned one called the Hercules. He did the original hauling from the lime deposit north of Kaslo. He was there in the 90s, and I presume he likely contracted and dug out somewhere along, blasted out the lime rock that they used at Pilot Bay way back in the very early 90s or late 80s. That one that you saw, that you mentioned at the South Bay, would likely be the old International. That would be the Great Northern boat. But their flagship was the Kaslo, and the Kaslo they had the races, and I remember some of the races between the steamer Kaslo, the Great Northern boat, and the Kuskonook, which of course was the fastest boat that the CPR had on the lake, and it would win hands down. There's a picture on one of the ferry boats of the race, it's called, and it's the Kaslo's in the foreground, and way off in the distance is the Kuskonook. Now,
you were inside some of those.
Oh yes, I was in many of those boats. One of the things that they always had in those days, the various churches in Kaslo. Kaslo had the famous Anglican church. It had a big Catholic church, a Presbyterian church, and then the splinter groups came in later. But they always got together and held a big Sunday school picnic. And usually it was the kokanee, but usually was the moye. And it would, on a given Saturday, I guess, it would not be on a Sunday, it was called a Sunday school picnic. And several years it was at the Outlet Hotel at Proctor. Yeah. And the other times, that's why they had it in the South Bay, what they call Sawmill Bay, at the Pilot Bay area. And it was in that area where the beehive ovens were still there. The small boy, I recall these beehive ovens where they actually filled them full of cordwood and burned them to make the charcoal for the original operation at the Pilot Bay Smelter. They were using charcoal as they did in the days of King Solomon.
Were there still buildings remaining there?
Yes.
Like the old bunkhouses?
The bunkhouses, and there's a business section there, some big stores, big department stores. My father, being in business at that time, he did shipped a lot of dry goods to people that were still in and around Pilot Bay. There were still people in and around Pilot Bay until the Great Northern went out of commission. CPR, of course, gradually took over everything, but previous to that, you see, the Great Northern, ran down from Crescent to Kuskonook, ran right down through the flats from Vernon Street. That eliminated the paddle wheelers going up to Vernon Street, which was it was the headquarters of the steamers at the south end of the operation. A lot of my father's dry goods were shipped in bond to and cleared customs at Vernon Street. There was a full-fledged customs operation at Kaslo, customs and excise house there. But Kaslo, of course, had its own brickworks, and a lot of most of the chimneys in the town were all the brickyard was in the pocket there, just below the present hospital location. The red clay deposit was in there. Later became orchard land. There were several small orchards down in the pocket there.
What was the name of the brickwork?
Pardon?
What was the name of the company?
Brickworks. I don't recall. It. I do know that the bricks in my father's chimney in the house that was built in 1901 came from the brickyard, and it could have been still was in operation before I arrived at the family residence. And there was a brewery there, a small brewery in Kaslo, just near the brickyard, and of course the Langham, the heritage building in Kaslo today, was it had a varied history. It's more of pop works, ginger ale and sour sarsaparilla and products of that. The man the name of, can't recall it, but there was, for years, there was a makeshift do of a champagne bottle on the highest point of the Langham building. It even had gold gilt, and it was a replica of a 3-foot high champagne bottle at the Langham. Of course, the Langham fell into the hands of Mr. Curl, and it was also the headquarters of Mr. Halen, the local surveyor there, who stayed on in Kaslo for a number of years. And, I guess he was and then he was succeeded as a land surveyor in the Kaslo area by Mr. Dawson, who moved later down the line into Nelson here and was a leading surveyor in the district. But all the mines in the Kaslo area and the Sandon area were, for the most part, Crown-granted mineral claims, and that required a BC land surveyor to it. The whole country was absolutely blanketed with Crown-granted mineral claims, right from Kaslo clean through to Sandon, New Denver, Silverton, a solid mass, and an inch of ground wasn't surveyed and Crown-granted, and then, of course, quickly abandoned when there was no ore. Most of them were wildcats, you see. But my father was 21 when he was in business in Kaslo, and he upstaked many wildcat prospectors who came in from the Butte, Montana country and operated up in the Poplar area and also up in the Hauser Creek area. There is a small creek up there named after my father. There's Gigwich Creek and Beerman Creek, all prominent people in Kaslo who grub-staked these prospectors who were a dime a dozen. They were all over the place. And of course, I would be only a very, very small boy. About a year or two afterwards, when they had the big, the Lucky Jack strike at Poplar in 1905.
That's the gold strike.
The gold strike. Incidentally, I heard Mr. Hanna, who lived at Argenta, say that that's Leander Hanna that lived for many years here in Nelson. He was a lumber tycoon in the Kaslo area. I remember him saying that the Lucky Jack strike was salted with gold from Colorado, and the people who salted it, they were not interested in the mining. It was a town site. They sold the lots. My father bought 2 lots at Poplar, and the CPR were building from Lardeau straight up to Poplar area, and they bought out the Great Northern about 1905 or 1906. They were building from Argenta up, had surveyed town sites way up in the upper Duncan and up in there, and the CPR bought them out. A man named Carlson was the prime contractor there, with nothing but teams of horses and equipment like that. They built that railroad from Lardeau to Girard, and for years and years, the federal government, of course, they were responsible for all the wharves on Kootenai Lake. They kept the log jams clear in the Lardeau and the Duncan. And Andy Jardine Sr., for years and years, used to lead he picked up the workmen in the Kaslo area, and it was an annual job for a large number of people in Kaslo to clean out all the log jams on the Lardeau River on the Duncan. The Duncan, of course, was navigable clean way up to Haley's Landing. My father bought several rowboats, and they used to rowboat and pole right up the Duncan River to Hauser Lake, as it was called then, and then the 10 or 12 mile long lake, and then up the upper Duncan would be 12 miles to Haley's Landing, and that was the upper end of the navigation.
There was a hotel there, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. And Jack Haley and his sister Maud lived there for decades, and the famous big game guide Earl Stevens had a trap line in that general area there. I met as a youngster. I remember him. He was part Indian. He wore a black stovepipe hat and had piercing black eyes, but he was a very, very well-known big game hunter, even into the 20s. He chiefly for grizzly bear in the Lardeau country. Earl Stevens by name.
I have a picture of his log cabin.
Yeah, that would be in the upper Duncan country, and even in 1920, 21, 22, he was still guiding people from the Cleveland area, the American side, chiefly for the grizzlies, which were quite prevalent up in that area.
Is he the one who's responsible for trying to start Spencer City?
He could be. That Spencer City is in the upper Duncan, extreme Westfall country, way up in there. Now there was a town site up in there, to the best of my knowledge. My father kept a daily diary from 1891 until his death in 1939. And we have it still intact, the daily diary, and it gives vivid stories of what went on up in the Lardeau, in the way of exploration and mining and clean. the staking of claims, and I remember reading in there about the Poplar later when I had access to it. You see, we still have the diary books intact. My brother has them in Victoria, and they, of course, have settled a lot of disputes. My father took accurate water measurements of various flood years at Kaslo in 1894, and the date June the 9th, June 8th and 9th, and the great flood in Kaslo, and the whole lower end of town went out. And then the next highest water to that would be about 1916. I was around at that time, and I remember of course, the new wharf had been built in Kaslo along about 1912 or 13, the big long wharf in the bay at Kaslo. And I remember the Kokanee, which was a regular boat on the Kaslo run, landing at the extreme upper end of the wharf. There's still a skeleton of the wharf there today, landing at the extreme upper end. In 1916, to my knowledge, the lake went up to 26 feet that year, above low water, 26 feet. The second to that was 1916. And then there was, of course, high water again in 1948, went up to about 24 feet. But I well recall in 1916, I was only a youth of about 12 or 14, but I remember I thought the whole lower end of town was going to go out. In 1894, you see, it cut over about where the present bridge is, that leads right into town from below the golf course. That's where the water broke through in 1894 and curled around at the base of the Presbyterian church and poured in just about where the spit light is, the navigation light as you go into Kaslo Bay. That's where until the water went down that year, that's where the Kaslo River poured into the lake. And along with it, of course, was terrible winds and one thing like that. And now,
well, with that wharf, the CPR wharf at Kaslo, that of course was the wharf for the K&S Railway. But when it stopped, it was still serving.
Well, that was a poor excuse for a wharf. It was not. It was merely there was not a slipway. The slipway was put in. When the standard gauge went into Kaslo, they put the slipway in that in later years functioned for Kaslo. There was a kind of it was a crude excuse for a wharf of granite rock and one thing or another right down where the Great Northern Station was, and that would be right where the remnants of the CPR station that functioned after 1914 when the railroad was standardized.
Yeah, well, the railway was still running into the Lardeau, the Arrowhead Kootenai Railway, right?
The CPR had the service to Lardeau. The Great Northern had service to Argenta, which was at the head of the lake on the other side. But they abandoned out in 1910 when the Great Northern, they just pulled out lock, stock, and barrel. They just abandoned everything in the country and all their land grants and one thing or another reverted to the Crown, and I imagine the CPR picked up some of them, you see.
And they ran the railway.
They ran the railroad, yes. And they ran that was a standard gauge railroad that ran into Poplar and to Girard. That was the standard gauge.
Right.
And the Nelson operation always had the slipway at Harrop, in the Harrop area. As a youth, I remember year after year the river out in front of Nelson here freezing over, and the boat service ended at Proctor and Balfour. And the railroad was always in to that point, and everything was brought in from 1897 with the completion of the Crow's Nest Railroad. Well, everything would come into that slipway, which was at just near in the Proctor Harrop area, just below Proctor. That present slipway is still there. So far as I know, it was operated when the Bluebell mine was running by Comingo, 15, 20 years ago.
I'm still curious about the A&K Railway. Did you ever run on that old converted truck? With the cars behind it?
The one that ran at Lardeau, you mean?
Yeah, it's up the Lardeau, the Arrow Kootenai Railway. Or what they call Galloping Goose.
The Galloping Goose. Several people had that. It was quite a deal. It was just a Ford engine, to the best of my recollection, and it had a tow. It kind of had a trailer, four-wheel deal. They had the same deal for a year or two on the Kaslo operation of the narrow gauge up to Bear Creek, which was just below Whitewater. That was the narrow gauge. It was called a speeder service. And Pet Walsh, the resident superintendent, was a neighbor of my parents, and I used to get quite a few rides up and down on that one, but I never did, other than the one at Girard. I never got a chance on that one. That was quite something. It operated quite successfully, I would say, but I don't think anybody made any money. The operation that Maitland Harrison was connected with, and I think it was some bad bookkeeping, one thing or another. They never had a chance to make any money. I think somebody absconded with some of the money, just as they did at Girard many years before. They absconded with a lot of the investment money there. That's one of those stinking cedar bugs. Those bloody things. Pardon me. You'll have to erase that.
No problem.
Yeah. Now, if you any questions you'd like to ask or throw at me, I have a fairly good memory.
You certainly do. I'm just wondering if you remember anything about the Silver King, Nelson.
The Silver King, and the Hall brothers.
Yeah.
Well, just word of mouth of what my father. You see, he came into Nelson in 1891, 1892. He had the store on Vernon Street. And then they moved it into Kaslo as soon as the paint strike was made. Now, I wouldn't know, but there's a lot of reference in my father's diary in 1891 and 1892 to the Silver King. And his entries, of course, were made in Nelson at that time. That's just a little before my time.
Yes, and also you lived in Kaslo.
I was, of course, in Kaslo, but
you probably remember some of the tramways and so on.
Oh, yes, I remember all the tramways. Now, Riblet was the tramway genius. He was a Frenchman headquartered in Spokane area, and he had built a number of tramways in and around Mullen, Idaho, and Wallace, Idaho, and then the Kellogg country. And then, of course, he was the builder of all these tramways in the Kaslo area. There were many, many more in the Kaslo area than there were in the Nelson area.
Is he the same person who had a house in Nelson?
Riblet.
Yeah.
Yes, he operated in his headquarters in Nelson for a time, out of Spokane.
But he built a lot of tramways.
He supervised, built, and contracted for 2 tramways in the South Fork of Kaslo Creek, the one at the Montezuma and the one at the Joker. There was one laying on the ground there on the Mansfield Creek side of the Joker mill site. It's still laying on the ground. The tram line is still there.
That's up towards the park.
It's in the park, actually in the park. That is laying there, and there's one and still laying on the ground, about 3 miles out of Nashton.
Yes.
The Montezuma Basin was there, and the tram line ran right in there. The bottom of the Montezuma Hill, as they call it. That tram line it's still laying, just lays on the ground. You know, all the timber, you know, they're all down in the ground.
The ore buckets.
The ore buckets, yeah. As a matter of fact, Douglas, my son, salvaged one of those ore buckets.
Yes. From
one of them. There was the one at the Lucky Jim was just a 2-bucket one. The one at the
Joker.
At the Joker. Well, it was just a straight one. To my knowledge, I don't think it ever ran. It was constructed, but they used to do all that work before they located any ore. There was no diamond drilling in those days. But in Sandon, of course, there was 8 or 10 tram lines running into Sandon. They ran in from the Slocan Store, the Silversmith, the Ruth Hope. There was at least 7 tram lines right in Sandon. They came in down in the little valley there, and they were all handling jig mill ore. That ore was riffled out and separated the gangue material carrying the zinc, and the zinc was these lead nuggets of silver lead, or galena as they call it. But and there was a 2-bucket one at the Kootenai Florence. Right there at Princess Creek, which is in the Woodbury Creek area. There was a 2-bucket one there that ran up and down. The loaded tram cars, buckets with the ore came down, and the empty one went back up. They were just 2-bucket affairs. That was a little short one. It was less than a mile in length, the one at Princess Creek. But that was running in 1915, 1916, 1917. When the mill was built. That's the mill that underwrote the money to extend the power line up to Princess Creek, the city of Nelson. Power line ran into Princess Creek, which is just in the Woodbury Creek area, and that was the North Shore power line was made available with the money from this mining operation there, but it soon petered out, and Kaslo, of course, had its own power plant. That was the Alexander family. They owned the Ruth Hope mine in Sandon, and were also instrumental in the railroad, which was originally built by English capital into Sandon, and then it was purchased by the Great Northern and Jim Hill. But that was built by English money, operating the Ruth Hope and several other mines in the Sandon area. And they also owned the Reeves McDonald mine out here in the Selma-Weimar country. And they were a splinter group of the Mon Nickel Company in England. The Alexander family. They owned the power plant in Kaslo, and they owned the city waterworks. And he was, and the hospital was built by and his George Alexander's sister was the matron of the first hospital in Kaslo. She married Mr. Papworth later. That's the Victorian Order of Nurses Hospital in Kaslo. The only one, I think, under a charter of the Victorian Order of Nurses, I think it was the only one in Canada, as a matter of fact.
I think we're getting close to the end of this side of the tape. Maybe we should pause it for a second. We'll turn it over, okay? You want to talk about raw hiding? And
yes, back after the wide gauge was put into operation, running into Bear Lake, I used to go up there to Scotty Mitchell's and do some fishing, and I saw Ernie Toogood, a brother of Charles Toogood, the famous operating the famous string of pack horses in the Sandon area. I saw him bringing ore down from the Panama mine, which laid up the hill behind Bear Lake, and it was a high-grade operation. He had about between 8 and 10 pack animals, 3 or 4 mules among them, and I watched them unload these sacks of ore, these high-grade sacks of ore, in the shed at Bear Lake, and he'd haul off and throw the bags off to one side. These bags weighing at least 150 pounds. There seemed to be, looked to me as if there were 3 sacks of ore. They would run 100 to 150 pounds on a bag. And he of course was an expert at throwing this diamond hitch. And he'd haul off and throw them on a neat pile there and haul off and kick it, and the animal would move on and another one would take its place. It was quite something to see them. That's the only operation in and around Kaslo, although I heard many stories of what had happened in and around Kaslo before the railroad was built. They were packing ore down from some of the claims in the South Fork area of Kaslo Creek, and also from this True Blue mine that overlooks the village of Kaslo. It went up Kemp Creek. The pack trail went up Kemp Creek and zigzagged down to the True Blue mine, which overlooked the village of Kaslo, and it was a copper deposit, apparently high grade, but petered out, and then they had a disastrous accident there, and there was a number of men killed in the snow slide and a bunch of pack animals, and that was the end of the operation. But I vividly remember Charlie Toogood at Bear Lake bringing down. He'd make the trip up in the morning, and in the late afternoon, down he'd come with this string of pack animals and unload the ore in these heavy jute bags. And they were, depending on the quality of the ore, it was very high-grade mine, the Panama operation, some 6 or 8 miles above Bear Lake, on the ridge separating it from the Whitewater Valley. But I know nothing about the famous Andy Daney and the operations in the Lardeau, but he was the king of the packers, all right. But Toogood was, his operation, the 2 Toogoods, that was a big operation in Sandon, because that was all high-grade ore there that they were bringing down in the latter years. It was all, a lot of it was hand-sorted, you see.
How many animals?
Well, between about 10 or 12, and they were one tied to the other, the tail to the front end of the animal, and the tail would string along, and they'd come right down into Bear Lake. It was quite something to see the whole operation. But that died out, of course. My father was interested in an operation up at Spring Creek, which was in the Bear Creek area. He had this string of pack animals run by Steve Cleveland. He was the big packer in the Kaslo area, Steve Cleveland, and he hauled down the equivalent of as my father said later, was the first car of ore brought down to the sampler in Kaslo. The sampler was the building over near where Jones Boys Marina is located today, and the ore would go down into the States from there. And eventually, I don't know, they get it down into the Jennings, Montana country, I think, would possibly end up in Butte or Anaconda. That's about it as far as the back animals are concerned.
You never saw any rawhiding, did you?
No. Rawhiding was before my time, although the trails up to the Zuni mine and the other ones were all built for rawhiding. They were little short switchback deals, and no, that was before my time.
Well, I was just wondering if you'd ever seen it. Do you remember anything about fruit ranching in either the Nelson area or the Kaslo area?
Well, more in the Kaslo area. Mr. Cockle, J.W. Cockle, who had the, along the way, he was the locator of that huge galena, 60-ton galena block of ore that came down in the Sandon area. He's the man that stands in that picture, which is still in the archives, J.W. Cockle, and of course later he built a hotel in Kaslo in partnership with Mr. Papworth and Kaslo Hotel, and then he got in a horticultural business, and he had the first of the Lambert and the Bing cherries in the Kaslo area, and he also he propagated potatoes. He did a bit of everything in it. Along the way, he had the famous collection of butterflies and moths, that cases and cases of them. They're in the Smithsonian Institute in the States today. These famous collection of moths and butterflies that Mr. Cockle gathered for years.
From all over the world, or just this area?
The Kootenays in particular.
Really?
Yes. The collection is in the Smithsonian. You can trace it down. You make some inquiries about it. It's a famous collection.
But do you remember anything out, for instance, the fruit ranching out Shutty Bench and so on?
Yes, I remember the North Road, the construction of the North Road and the building of the North Road. And this would be in the heyday of road construction around Kaslo, around 1908 to 1912 and 13. Then most of the settlements up on the Shutty Bench area, a lot of it, the private effects of the Campbells and the other people that settled there, the road hadn't been even constructed at that time. Then the Guthrie brothers, Rupert and Nigel Guthrie, had the cherry orchard that later Captain West had, and that's where the little cherry disease hit the Kaslo area first.
How did that?
Well, that apparently, as far as I know, I'm not a horticultural expert. As far as I know it, the carrier was these Japanese cherry trees. The famous colored Japanese cherry trees were the carrier, and the bees carried the virus to the north end of Kootenay Lake, and that was the end of the cherry operation in Kaslo, where they grew the famous Lambert cherries and Bing cherries. It was big business in Kaslo. There was quite an acreage there. Captain West had 20 acres of cherries there in the heyday.
Why have I heard of Captain West?
Well, Captain West, he bought the Guthrie operation, the Guthrie brothers. They went away to the war and never did operate it. That it would be right in, it would be about a mile north or a mile and a half north of Camp Paradise in the Kaslo area there. The Shutty family, of course, were pioneers there, after whom the bench was named. They were in there before there was any road to the north out of Kaslo. That north road was constructed in around 1910, 11, and 12. And the furthest point north at that time was at the Campbell, Colonel Campbell, who later went overseas and was commander of the 54th Battalion and was killed at Vimy Ridge. And then Colonel Cowan showed up later and brought those dogs out from the old country, the famous Great Dane strain of world-size Great Dane dogs. And I think the daughter still raises Great Danes there. They brought out they were blue, kind of a bluish color, but they had they had white ones and black ones and harlequins and the whole works. But the orchard country, that boom died right quickly when the little cherry virus hit most of the cherries in the Boswell. It emanated, seemed to have started around Boswell and worked north.
So it was the cherry disease, but also, I guess, the First World War, after that.
Yeah, well, my mother had about a dozen trees in Kaslo, and she used to ship to Lethbridge, to Plunkett and Savage in Lethbridge, getting about $4 to $5 for a 20-pound crate in the 4-basket crates that they shipped in those days. There were 4 baskets, and there were approximately 20 pounds of cherries in the 4 baskets. But this man Cockrell, he played around with a lot of apples too. Kaslo, of course, was famous for its Gravenstein apples, and the annual fruit fair show there, held in the drill hall, was quite something. And these orchards here on the west arm, the big one, of course, was J.J. Campbell. They grew varieties that were chiefly shipped to the old country. They used to ship straight carloads of them to Montreal, and then they were transshipped there. Cox's Orange Pippin, Gravensteins, winter bananas, and great Northern Spy, and a lot of apples that you never hear anything about today, but they were marvelous eating apples. Gravenstein was the king of them all. It was not a uniform for size. It was a misshapen apple for packing purposes. The minute the Macintosh Red came in and these uniform sized ones, that was the end of the Gravensteins and a lot of these other fancy varieties that were famous in the Kootenays in the early days. This man Cockrell, he experimented and did a lot of cross-pollinization of this and that, but he never seemed to accumulate too much money, but he was sure a wizard at fruit, I'll tell you. Now,
I was just wondering, earlier this summer we were talking about some of these sports.
Oh, yeah.
In the area, and you were mentioning tennis players and so
on. Oh,
on.
yes. Well, Mr. Dixon, who was brought out from the old country by the Alexander family as an electrician to install the Kaslo power plant, was a famous tennis player. He later settled in the Willow Point area here. But Kaslo always had some tennis players. Mrs. Stubbs was perhaps the most famous one. She won many West Kootenay championships in her day, competing here in Nelson, and even Maitland Harrison was quite a famous tennis player, but his brother Bill actually was a spare on the Canadian Davis Cup team when Swangers was the big wig, and they had the playdowns on the front courts of the Balfour Beach the Balfour Hotel, the CPR Hotel, which lay there. It had 3 or 4 tennis courts, and the Davis Cup playdowns were held actually there 1 year. The Canadian champion, Swangers, was the big star for Canada in those days, and had close contacts with the CPR. And
so Bill Harris was involved.
Bill Harrison was the outstanding player in the Kootenai. He went away to the war and then came back and migrated on up into the north. The last I heard of him, he was up around 103 Mile House. That would be Maitland's younger brother.
Right.
And then, of course, Noel Backus was another one who played tennis. He was custodian of the Moyer the first year it was put in on the dry dock at Kaslo there for several years. Noel Backus was the custodian of the Moyer.
He had a fruit ranch.
He had a fruit ranch at Fry Creek, at the McIntosh's Landing.
Whatever happened. That was...
Well, he got in... funny, he got in the strawberries to start with, and he was trying to get the product into Kaslo while it was fresh, and he ran into some storms, and then he went into the chicken business afterwards. This is at McIntosh's Landing, which is in the Fry Creek area. But then this man, Honeymoon Harris, that had a famous Honeymoon Ranch, directly across the lake from Mirror Lake, about where Bernard Creek pours into the lake. There's about a 20-acre patch, and he...
That's just around Garland Bay?
Yes, it would be about a mile south of there. Okay. He had this orchard. He put in the orchard on auctions on land owned by the Great Northern. The Great Northern Land Grant extended up on the other side of the lake. And Honeymoon Harris, as he was called, he came in there, and in 1911, and he cleared the land, and he put in an assorted collection of fruit. He had a bit of everything. He had apples, and he had plums and peaches and prune plums and pears and whatnot. But he didn't tell the people that it would take 10 years before they'd have any paying crop or edible fruit off them. But he was smart enough to put 3 acres of strawberries in, right through for the present road that runs in north from Riondale, runs right through 3 acres of his old strawberry patch. And he brought the gullible people down from the prairie, and they had a couple milk Jersey cows there, and he fed them on strawberries and cream, and had the other foodstuff shipped in by boat. And after he gathered a few $1,000s, why, he skipped the country, taking his secretary with him. They went into Mexico. That was the start of the famous Honeymoon Ranch.
Well, was he called Honeymoon before?
Well, he said he was on his honeymoon, and they called it Honeymoon Ranch. That's how they got its name. He was a real promoter, I'll tell you that.
What was his real name?
Harris was his family name.
What was his given name? Do you know?
No, I never did know. They called him Honeymoon Harris. But he operated out of the King George Hotel in Kaslo. And he had this beautiful secretary with him. And he was supposedly on his honeymoon when he brought her in. And together they skipped out when they left. But there were many other orchards. Matthew Brothers had a famous orchard up on Hauser Lake. The two Matthews brothers were mauled by a bear in their orchard, and both died from the effects of the mauling of this bear. And that is where that has now been flooded by the Duncan Reservoir. But Kamenko had located an ore deposit there, and then they were prospecting and proving the vein and the location of the ore and all that, and then they filled it in, and it lays dormant, covered there today by the the rising and the falling of the Duncan Reservoir each year. But the Duncan Dam is located about 5 miles south of Simpson's Landing. Simpson's Landing was originally the bottom of Hauser Lake, the south end of Hauser Lake. That was downstream 5 miles is where they built the dam. If you go up in that country today, you can see remnants of the old Great Northern, their first stop in the construction of the railroad north from Argenta would be Hauser Landing. And Simpson had a store there. And but that big trestle that would run across the south end of what was known as Hauser Lake in those days, it was never known as Duncan Lake or anything. Hauser Lake was the 10-mile-long lake. It's in a slipped valley there, and the Matthew brothers had this fruit orchard there, 100 acres or more, and they did ship some carloads of apples in the fall, but there's lots of bear in the Lardeau country and the Duncan particularly, and they seem to migrate into these orchards, particularly in the years when there's no huckleberries around, while they make for the apple orchards and pears and plums and peaches. And Honeymoon Harris and his operation there at Bernard Creek, he had everything, and today, why, there's still fruit being produced there, and the bears have mauled all the trees. They're all split and laying on the ground and all sorts of, but there's still some products of the old orchard there today, and there's always a couple of sow bears around there with some young ones that knocking down the trees and splitting them. That in the Kaslo area, why today then the codling moth hit the country, and it just cleaned everything up in the way once the scab hit the country. Why you have to today you have to spray 3-4 times to control all these pests that are laid in, the eggs are laid in there, and when the fruit's in bud.
Getting back to sports, you were involved with baseball and so on, weren't you?
Well, Kaslo was always famous for its hockey and baseball teams, and as a youngster, I used to go up to the ballpark, which was in the upper part of town in the present-day school grounds, and Kaslo had a famous ball team, also had a famous hockey team. They had one of the first skating rinks in the Kootenays, the small rink with a cedar-shaped roof, small-size skating rink with 2 curling rinks. And Sam Green and R.F. Green, later to become member of Parliament for the Kootenays, they were introduced curling to the Kaslo area, curling first at Mirror Lake. I think the first curling in the Kootenays was on Mirror Lake.
On the lake itself.
On the lake itself. And of course, Charlie Burkness had the big ice cutting operation there and the big ice house, and had the contract for all the ice supply for the steamers and the ice houses in the Kootenays. That was Charlie Burkness at Mirror Lake.
So he cut that from Mirror Lake.
From Mirror Lake, which always had a ice 12, 16, 18 inches in thickness, depending on the severity of the winter. The other operation for cutting ice would be on Moya Lake. The CPR had ice houses over there at the time of the construction of the Crow's Nest Pass Railroad division. Well, they had big ice house in Cranbrook, and they cut ice there. But Kaslo had 2 curling sheets in the rink that was put up in. The rink was built in 1895 or 1896, and when the CPR came into the Kaslo area in later years when they standardized the old Great Northern or K&S Railroad, when they standardized it by Bob Paget was the resident engineer for the CPR during the construction. Tierney was the contractor. William Tierney of Vancouver was the contractor on the rebuild of the railroad to standard gauge certification. But Paget was very sport-minded, and he had, among his survey crew, he had some baseball players and some hockey players, and he was instrumental in removing the 2 curling sheets and widening out the skating rink so that it was not a bad size skating rink, but poorly lit under present day standards. You couldn't see a long shot from halfway down the ice. Kaslo had a direct current electric system, and the air that was subject to a lot of dimming out at times. And baseball, they were very good at baseball. They had a lot of good players come through there. And I recall in 1913, when the construction of the railroad to the standard gauge specifications, the famous team in Nelson was called the Hungry Nine. It was a standout baseball team. I would be 10 or 12 years old at the time, but I was sort of mascot for the Kaslo ball team, and the 24th of May was always Kaslo's big day. And in 1912 and 13, in the height of the construction of the railroad, the Hungry Nine team was brought into Kaslo for the annual big celebration there, and Mr. Paget had some wheelings and dealings with the Great Northern in connection with survey lines and one thing and another up Kaslo Creek, so it was convenient for him to go out to Spokane, and he went out there, and there he met the president of the Spokane Indians professional baseball team, and they mentioned that they would happen to have a holiday around the 24th of May for the team, so they smuggled 4 players into Kaslo. They brought them in and put them up at the King George Hotel, and there was a lot of money bet on the game, to my knowledge, and I recall the street residence, the Joe Street residence is right across from the ballpark in the upper part of town, and they smuggled these 4 players from the Spokane Indians. They had them working out on the lawn of the street residence, and when Owen Desmond, who was the umpire that day, went to call out the lineup of the batteries for the big game, the Kaslo had the 2 grandstands in the park in the upper part of town, and I'll tell you, it was really something. They announced the batteries for the Nelson team first, and they said Harry Bishop catching for Nelson, pitching Dr. Harry Pitts. Loud boos from everybody in Kaslo, and wild cheers from a few hundred that had come up from Nelson on the big boat, an excursion boat. And then they announced the batteries for Kaslo. And, of course, everybody expected it to be Clarence White catching and Billy McKay pitching. But they said they called off the catcher for the team, and loud cheers from the people in Kaslo. And then they said, George Klink, pitching for Kaslo. And Klink was the most famous ball player in the Northwestern League, standing 6'6", and he just proceeded to mow them down. And Kaslo, of course, won the game. There was a lot of money bet, and there was a lot of fist fights, and one thing and another. Fellas were rolling all over the ground, cheaters, and doing all sorts of things to smuggling in these ball players. Those days, rock drilling was the big thing. Drilling. And the famous team, of course, was Ericsson and
Silverton.
And Ericsson from Silverton and McGillivray. They were world's champions, admitted. And as a young boy, I saw them beat one after another of the imports that were brought in from Rosslyn, even from the Coeur d'Alene country there. And boy, there was really something to see them. This Ericsson was a barrel-chested Norwegian, and McGillivray, I swear to God, the man weighed 250 pounds and had shoulders 2.5, 3 feet wide. He was a monster, Nova Scotian, and they were unbeatable, and they actually performed, I guess, along the way at one of the world's fairs in Chicago. But they were a standout. But for years they used to have it near the drill hall, and then it was at the ballpark in Kaslo, in the upper part of town. But incidentally, I saw in 1910, I saw J.W. Cockle put on a competition there against Lardeau Jack McDonald. They both arrived at the scene where the rock drilling was with the pack animal, with their pack board above them, and they had to strike a fire and unload the animal, strike a fire, and cook some bannock in front of an open fire. I remember the fry pans being tilted up and the bed of ashes there, and I don't know, they sort of called it a solve, but I think Lardeau Jack McDonald, he's supposed to make the famous best bannocks in the Lardeau country. Why, I think he won the competition that day. But Kaslo, and I remember the hose reel races on the main street of Kaslo. And of course there was a lot of imports, 100-yard dash men and all that. All these teams were rigged in those days. It was really something. But Owen Desmond, who came to Kaslo in the 90s as a professional baseball player, but stayed on to run a pool room and a billiard set up there. He was an import back in the 90s from the States, but he lived the rest of his days out in Kaslo and was a well-known umpire in later years when I was playing baseball, and he was a big shot umpire. As far as hockey is concerned, by Kaslo was always had an intermediate rated team and then several good junior teams. I used to play on an intermediate team there that played against New Denver and Sandon and Silverton and Slocan City.
And you take the train to these places?
Yes, they.
A Friday night or
yes, and
how would you do it?
Well, this was, of course, when the standard gauge ran into Sandon at that time, but it ran into Three Forks and then chugged up Cody Creek to Sandon, and it had its own skating rink. And I recall the flu epidemic went through Kaslo, and a couple of Kaslo players, and I was only about 14 years or 15 years old at the time, and they recruited me to play goal there. And on the Nelson team, they had Johnny Harris, the owner of the Rico Hotel in Sandon. He was a great sporting fan, and he had imported a couple players from Nelson, play there, and this may come as a surprise to a lot of people around here, but Waldo Ferguson was one of them. At that time, he was a lawyer in training, and later became one of the leading lawyers and barristers in Nelson. I guess he spent the rest of his life here. And Eddie Murphy, he was a star player on the Rovers hockey team in Nelson, the painter. And they were imported by Johnny Harris that year into Sandon, and they gave us a real good thrashing. They had another fellow by the name of Evans that they brought in from Phoenix, and boy, I think they scored 12 goals on me that night. It's a disgrace, but I would be only 14 years old. Well,
when would you play hockey? Would it used to be a
well,
Saturday?
I played
during the night. You know, they'd play Saturday night.
Oh yes, they played
or any night of the week.
Any night of the week. Kaslo Rink ran. It was a local person would bid in for the ice making privileges there, and it was just natural ice, and it was of course dependent on the weather, and of course you got a January thaw where the rink got most of the ice melted out, and then you had to start from scratch, and all games were canceled. Silverton was an awfully good hockey town. They had their own small rink. New Denver did, and Slocan City, and Kaslo. That was a sort of a league in its own. It classed as an intermediate league. And then later, in when I moved on over to trail, and then I joined the trail team and played for a number of years with the Smoke Eaters. On some of their trips back east, I was on 6 championship teams that won BC championships in 6-7 consecutive years. And I played as far east as Port Arthur, and played in Winnipeg, played Calgary along the way. So I had my fun along the way. And
did you continue to play goalie, or?
I played goal for the Smoke Eaters from 1928 to 1933. I was the goaltender, and they, of course, the trail team was pretty famous for its talent, but they were mostly imports from the Canmore area and the Blairmore area and Calgary. They built up, and then a few years later, I retired in 1932, but a few years later, well, within 4 or 5 years later, they won the Allen Cup. But Kimberley actually won the Allen Cup the year before Trail did. They brought a whole team in from the Regina area. The Trail, when they built up their team, they went into Edmonton, brought out 1 or 2 players from Edmonton, Calgary, and then brought in 2 hot shots from Winnipeg, Junior Monarchs, and Dave Dushank from North Battleford. And they won the Allen Cup in Trail in about 1937, 1938, just about the time the war started. But Nelson always did have, they had the wonderful rink that built by the Patrick brothers in the upper part of Nelson. Lester Patrick and Frank Patrick were raised around Kenora, Ontario. Their father was a lumber baron out here in the Slocan country. But the 2 boys put in a year or so here in Nelson. And I think you'll find up in the old YMCA building the world's champion hockey team from Nelson, headed by the Lester Patrick and Frank Patrick and 2 of the Bishop brothers, and Bob Thompson and Joe Thompson rather, and I forget the names of the others, but they actually claimed the world's championship back about 1909.
Oh, I see.
It was a long time ago, all right, but Lester Patrick and Frank Patrick, with the backing of Pat Burns, built the rink up here in the upper part of Nelson. It was the best rink in the Kootenays for many, many years.
That was up towards Cottonwood Lake.
Yeah, that's right. It was there's a
garage.
A garage up there, or a motor home up there.
The motel.
Motel.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was up around the houses for the streetcar system.
Well, then Pat Burns, you see, who had the butcher shops here, he had a brother in Vancouver by the name of Dominic Burns. And Dominic Burns backed the Patrick brothers when they built the biggest rink in Canada in Vancouver, the Denman Street Arena. It was the first artificial rink built in Western Canada. It was a monster rink. It was a 3-decker wooden structure. It seated 12,500 people, and there were 4 curling rinks in the basement. They never could sell curling in Vancouver in those days, and eventually they pulled the pipes out and used them for replacing worn-out pipes upstairs when the big rink. And the Patrick brothers, of course, ran the professional league out here in the West, the Lester Patrick being in Victoria and Frank Patrick being in Vancouver, and then there was a franchise in Portland and one in Seattle.
But their father was in Nelson.
And their father was,
Slocan.
in the Slocan Valley. And he had big logging operations out there, and the boys spent one winter here. And that's the winter that they played hockey for Nelson and claimed all this championship.
Well, was there much logging activity in the area in the old days? Or
well, in the Kaslo area, they logged. There was the big mill, of course, at Girard. There was a big sawmill there. That would be owned by English capital, but that was a standard gauge railroad that ran from Lardeau to Girard, where the old fish hatchery was later years, and where the big fish spawn today. But the Kaslo area was logged out by Cook Brothers, and they were a splinter group from the Great Northern Minneapolis area, and they logged here and there, up and down in Kootenai Lake, and then they used to run logs down the Lardeau and move them down into Kaslo. And then, of course, in Nelson there were, a number of big sawmills here. And I recall I'm getting back now. I'm getting out of the Kaslo area, but I was here in Nelson several times when that firebug was operating here and burning the sawmill, and he burned the smelter works and this and that. I recall the firebug, as they called him. I don't know whether they ever brought him
they brought him to trial, but
was his name Raymond or something?
I can't recall.
Yeah, but anyway, he was I had a grandmother who was resident in Nelson at the time, and I used to come, and they used to put me aboard the boat in Kaslo, and she used to come down with Big John down to the wharf here in Nelson, and Big John with his team of horses, and she'd ride me up to where she had her home here in Nelson.
Where was that?
It would be up about a street or two above Baker Street on the hillside there. I bet you I could find a place today, of course, but Jenny E. Harris was her name, and she was dabbling around in real estate. She was quite a businesswoman, and she was up to her neck when all the original Duke-War lands were being sold and bought and one thing and another. She had options on a lot of land and one thing and another. I don't know whether she ever made any money or not, but she was kind of a businesswoman and a pioneer around here. Her husband separated, and he lived in the Creston area and was a government road foreman there and had a team of horses. And my mother, who was born in Kaslo, of course, she had a brother, Ollie Harris, who was a teamster here for many years. Was one of the livery companies here. But those days I guess they're gone forever. I kind of running out of material now. Dr. Harton was Dr. Gilbert Harton was the man that brought me in the world in 1902. And then a year or two later, he moved into Nelson and went into partnership with Dr. Rose. Harton and Rose, or Rose and Harton, were the leading doctors here in Nelson for many years.
Do you remember much of Nelson, just on your business?
Well, I do remember, I remember coming into Nelson several times when the river froze over from here to Balfour, or to Proctor, and coming in on the train to Nelson, and my grandmother would meet me downtown here, and Big John would drive me up to her place of residence. And funny about that ice, there were people who actually skated from Proctor to Nelson on the edge of, so that the winters have changed. There's no getting around that. And Kaslo, of course, having a little more snow than Nelson, they had the famous sleigh run starting way in the upper reaches of Kaslo, way up on the upper bench there, way above the hospital, and you could run unobstructed with only teams of horses in Kaslo at the time. You'd run down and you'd end up down at the CPR dock at the right about where the Moyer is positioned today. You ran a whole mile, and some of these big sleighs were years ahead of their time. Oh yeah, and then Mrs. Vicky brought a famous American flyer that handled 6 people, and you had your foot in the stirrups, and they got. Oh, that American flyer was some machine. It was the only one in the Kootenai.
It flew.
It flew, I'll tell you, yes. And when it down at the bottom, right in front of the Langham, it used to shoot there, out. And sometimes it would be airborne for 30, 40 feet. And eventually it crashed. All the runners buckled over, and they had a full load of adults. And
when you speak of skating on the West Arm, though, do you think perhaps part of the reason why it used to freeze is because of the sternwheelers, which would churn up the water?
Well,
cold water from below.
The main lake never did freeze, except maybe say in part of the bay at Kaslo. But the CPR wharf in Kaslo, for decades, from the 90s, was down in the lower part of town, but the prevailing wind is from the north, but the West Arm is subject to approximately the same rise and fall as Kaslo. The Queens Bay gauging station, which is in operation today, there's only 2 or 3 feet difference on the measurement, like at Kaslo, and the measurement here is only 2 or 3 feet of a drop down. The big drop here, it was just below Nelson down here at Groman Narrows. There was a straight falls of about 10 feet right underneath the old bridge, right underneath the bridge. And then the West Kootenai, when they put the railroad in, they had to relocate the railroad when they put the Coral Inn Dam in. They brought these immense shacks out from eastern Canada, and they vertically raised the bridge at
that's down
the lower bridge.
Yeah.
Well, it would be at the sawmill there.
Yes. I know what you mean. I can't think.
Anyway, they vertically raised that about 12 feet and filled in daily. They never kept track. They kept pushing the day. Dutton and Grant were the big contractors on the relocation of that railroad when they put the Coral Inn Dam in.
Well, that bridge is where the old bridge was, which is just west of the current bridge.
That is correct. Yeah, that current bridge is a kind of the railroad is right near it, and it's a two-piece, there's a little island in there, yeah. That was Dutton Grant were the contractors on that. They were also the contractors in 1931 or 32 in the 35-mile railroad constructed from Kootenai Landing to Proctor. That would be about 1931. And that eliminated the use of all the tugs. There were 3 tugs hauling the products from trail concentrates and one thing and another in here. And of course the only other operation was the slipway at Proctor. And then that 35-mile railroad put in by the CPR, that was put in primarily because to eliminate these 3 tugs. There was the Valhalla and the Weimer and the Grant Hall was the biggie, the biggest one they had. That was the big one. But there's been great changes, and I
was going to ask you, now that you mentioned about the lake, because you fished this lake.
The lake. The great thing about the lake was that they cleared the log jams year after year. That was a big deal for employment in Kaslo in the fall. They'd clear the log jams in the Lardeau and clear the log jams in the Duncan River. And to the best of my recollection, the Duncan, the Lardeau came in right beside the present highway that runs from Lardeau to Girard. The Lardeau River came right in there. The Duncan seemed to be more over on the Argenta side, and it only in high water. The lake used to go up 20 feet. That was the average rise and fall of Kootenai Lake. When I was a small boy, it used to come up 20 feet in the runoff period in late May and into June. Well, into June. It used to go up 20 feet, and then we would go down again and freeze up in the winter time.
Well, you used to do a lot of fishing,
Oh yes, and it's all drained to the fishing on the crudest of equipment. The fly fishing was just out of this world, and of course there was no license originally. The federal government ran the fisheries in Kootenai Lake. There was no license to start with. That's not important really, because today they charge $12 for a license, $1 for senior citizens, but there's no fish around hardly. The lake is. But the bad thing about the whole thing is that pressure from the resort owners, they opened the season 12 months in the year. When I was a small boy, and for decades, the season closed on the 1st of November. That's 31st of October. You never fished until the 1st of May. And then the 1st of May, you went into action again. Not allowed the fish to run up the Lardeau River unobstructed, and immense runs of fish there, and these big giant Kamloops trout, you see. But the redfish were unmolested at Meadow Creek. And I remember the Indian canoes coming up from Kaslo each fall, these pointed Indian canoes.
Oh, the one with the points down towards the water.
Yes, they have one at Fort Steele today.
Yes,
the one is over there. I remember those Indians coming by the dozens into Kaslo with their families. They'd come up early in the season and they'd pick huckleberries, particularly around Woodbury Creek. And they would peddle 4 or 5 gallon gasoline drums with the lid taken off and a wooden thing across the top. They would peddle the huckleberries for 20 cents a pound or something like that. And then come September, there'd be about a dozen of these canoes come clean from the Crescent End, from the reservation there, and would go up to Meadow Creek. And it was their hereditary right to take kokanee in the spawning season. And a lot of people from Kaslo would go up there and they'd gas them, you see. But the Indians used all sorts of traps and one thing and another. They hollowed out cedar logs and then they'd derrick out and scoop out the kokanee and smoke them on racks. And they did that for a number of years, and then when the federal government decided to spawn a bunch themselves, they had the Indians went in there and slashed all the nets that the federal fisheries had there. They were netting and spawning kokanee as redfish, as they called them in those days. They just called them redfish. They didn't call them kokanee. So kokanee name came later. And they're landlocked sockeye. But they're then the Indians went in there and they slashed all the fishery people's nets where they were netting these kokanee for propagation purposes by spawning the eggs, fertilizing them. They slashed all the nets, and that was the end of the Indians' right to fish unmolested in the Lardeau, particularly at Meadow Creek.
What date would that be?
Oh, that would be through the 20s, through the 1920s. The provincial government sort of pushed in on the fisheries in the late 20s or very early 30s. It was an offshoot of the Jim Cunningham and Frank Butler were the first game commissioners, and they came out of the police, the provincial police.
Were they involved with the hatchery up at Gerard?
They ran it for a limited time, yes. They had Bud Thompson and some locals here. They ran it for a time, but again, they shipped out an awful lot. They shipped 50,000 fingerlings down into Pondray Lake, and in 5 years' time, they were catching 30-pounders down there. Pondray Lake apparently had kokanee in it too. You see, it was loaded with kokanee, and the minute they put introduced the Kamloops trout in there, they just went wild down there, and in 4 or 5 years, they were catching 30-pounders down there. But they fished them out down there, and then up here, I remember that the Kaslo Rod and Gun Club, they got subscription lists out all over town, and they put in a fish hatchery in Kaslo and a big pond there, and they had 1 million Kamloops trout in that big pond there, and they did they were grinding up during the war years when the Japanese were interned in Kaslo. They were grinding up a lot of the suckers and squawfish. Japanese brought in a bunch of fish nets, and they were allowed to fish a certain amount of trash fish. And they were grinding these up and feeding them, and they got some spectacular results in this pond there in Kaslo. But a bacterial poison got in there, and bango, they lost 750,000 fish and just died. It went through it like wildfire. When fungus hits these small fingerlings, when they're only about an inch long.
Kills them right off.
Yeah.
Where was that located? In the bay?
It was the Boy Scout Hall is in Kaslo. It's right down there where the new senior citizens place is, down in the beach area. But they always had water problems in Kaslo, you see, because it was a makeshift waterworks that the city had purchased from the Alexander family, and it was there were wooden mains all over town, and there was more water leaking out than was actually reaching the people downtown. And there was always a water shortage. And I think that they did lose a bunch one year with they lost the water supply too, which was dependent on the city water supply.
I see. Okay.
But today, they spawn 25 adult female fish and get 150, 160,000 eggs from them. They take them over to Wardner, have them there a year, and then they bring 20,000 back and put them in that feeding pen over at Jones's, and 20,000 at the end of the lake, and the other 140,000 or 130,000 are gone. We don't know where. They certainly don't come back to Kootenai Lake.
Are those
and that's one of the reasons why the fishery's gone down in Kootenai Lake.
The big Kootenai strain.
Yeah, the Kootenai, the Gerard strain, as they call it.
Yeah.
And the same one, they just fished out the mature big fish, the big Kootenai strain that was in the West Arm, and they put the shrimp in the lake. They just grew into astronomical size, huge. I have that picture in Kaslo, of that world record one that Alan Broom of Calgary caught, 9 pound, 12 ounce kokanee. Oh. I have the picture, and he has the fish. Terry Jones had it mounted and exhibited it all over the Northwest for 2 years, and then returned the fish to at no cost to Dr. Broom, and he has the fish mounted. The fish is mounted in Calgary today. Terry was good enough to, he exhibited it for 2 years and got all sorts of publicity about it. And today that Dr. Broom has that gorgeous, it's a beautiful thing, absolute perfect fish. Apparently it could have been 2 years longer than its normal 4 year span. And it was caught just north of Garland Bay, or
in the main lake.
In the main lake. Oh yes, it was caught just at the Inkpot Bluff, right adjacent to Inkpot Bluff, opposite Kaslo. But he brought it into camp, and I saw it, and I just looked at it, and I saw no spots on the tail. I said, "My God, man, that's a kokanee." So they rushed it over to Jones Boys, and of course they took it up to the butcher shop in Kaslo and had it weighed on a government tested scale. And
when was this?
It'll be about 5, 6 years ago.
That's not bad.
No.
You don't see them that size.
Oh Lord, the biggest fish caught at camp this year was only 10 inches. The biggest kokanee. Well,
I think we're just about near the end.
Yeah.